This week we'll continue the Child Language Acquisition unit by looking at phonological development. We must remember that when we're looking at phonology, when we're in the language level of phonology and phonetics, that it is purely about sound, and the individual sounds that we hear in words are called phonemes. Okay, so regardless of what a word looks like when it's written down using graphology, using the alphabet, it is once we say that word out loud, it is the individual sounds that we hear in that word that are relevant in this language level. Okay, so for example, the word enough has 6 graphemes. It has 6 letters, E-N-O-U-G-H. However, when we say the word enough, it actually only has 4 individual sounds in it. E, N, O, F. So enough. So that's 4 phonemes, and there we can see them being represented in the slanted brackets using the International Phonetic Alphabet. You have a copy of the IPA chart that you are allowed to have in the exam. That's been downloaded into your homework section, but you will have that, you will have a clean copy of that when you go into your child language acquisition exam and in your other exams for that matter. So it is very much worth being familiar with that, and we've already looked at that this year, and hopefully you will continue to look at that, use it as part of your homework, and use it to help you get through this PowerPoint. English speakers use around 44 phonemes in speech, and we say around because it depends on the accent that they use and whereabouts in the country they come from. This is going to have an impact on the children as well, so they will pick up the accent of the people around them, people using the child directed speech with them, their caregivers. And this is something that we will take into consideration later on when we're looking at how children pronounce words. One of the things that we need to consider is what accent that they're pronouncing those words in. Phonemes are not all acquired at the same time. Some phonemes are more difficult to produce than others. Consonants are particularly difficult because there are 3 different things that children have to control. One is the place of articulation, and that is what position their tongue is in their mouth, what's happening with their lips, what's happening with their teeth. The other is the manner of articulation, so how is the air coming out? Is it coming down the nose? That's a nasal sound with sounds like m and n. The other is plosive sounds, so where the air is stopped by articulators, by your mouth or the nose or the lips from coming out of the mouth, and then sort of released quickly in a sort of air explosion. So things like p and b and t and d, and that's why it's quite useful to think of those as explosive sounds because they are plosives. And then finally there are fricative sounds, and that is where the airflow is in some way prevented from coming out freely, and it creates friction, and so that is sounds like s or z, zh, and sounds like that where there is friction created. And then finally there is the throat, and that is whether a sound is a phoneme is voiced or unvoiced. Now all vowel sounds are voiced, but with consonant sounds they tend to come in pairs, and the pairs, one of the pairs will be a voiced sound and the other will be an unvoiced sound. So for instance we have pairs like p and b, so where they are both use both lips, p and b, they both use both lips, they both are plosive sounds, but a p is unvoiced and a b is voiced, and that is that there is more vibration in the throat. If you put your fingers on your Adam's apple as you say them in pairs, you'll find there's more vibration in the throat on the b sound than there is on the p sound, and that's because the b is voiced. Other pairs are things like k and g, so k is the unvoiced, g is the voiced. T and d, t is the unvoiced and d is the voiced, and many others. S and z are the same, and they have this voiced version and an unvoiced version, so the place and manner of articulation will be exactly the same in the pair, but the one difference will be this sort of vibration in the throat, the voicing in the throat. And so children can struggle with any one of these three things or a combination of them, and they have to get all three in a particular right in a particular way to create a particular sound. You might remember from the frameworks for phonetics and phonology that phoneme sounds are divided into vowel sounds and consonant sounds. And vowel sounds tend to be easier for children to acquire, and they usually acquire the 20 or so vowel sounds that we have, vowel phonemes that we have in the English language by the time they're about 2.5. And this is because the way that they are articulated is a lot different to the consonant sounds. So if you sort of try and create some vowel sounds, you'll notice that you don't really have to do a lot with your mouth and with your lips and your tongue. So you can say a, e, I, o, and sort of not have to move any of those to any great extent, and that's why it's easier for them. However, with the consonant sounds, that's where the place and the manner of articulation becomes more relevant, and there has to be more control, and it can take children up until they're sort of 4, 5, 6 years old to be able to control these, to create all the sounds they need. And some phonemes they will acquire quite early, and some quite late. And one of the things that we will look at is the order of the development and sort of how old, and sort of the expectation of the order of that development, how old these children will be when they acquire certain phoneme sounds. The earliest consonant sounds for a child to acquire tend to be the nasals, and that is the m and the n, and the voiceless plosives, so things like p, t, and k. Okay, so the m, for instance, is a bilabial nasal, the n is an alveolar nasal, and then the p, again bilabial plosive in this case, t alveolar plosive, k velar plosive. Okay, so depending on whereabouts in the mouth the tongue is, will often tell us what sort of sound it is. P, the bilabial, then is two lips together. T is the tongue on the alveolar ridge at the back of the teeth. K is the velar plosive, because the tongue is touching the soft part of the roof of the mouth, which is called the velum. The last sounds to be acquired tend to be the dental fricatives. These are the sounds that we represent graphologically with TH, but there are two very distinct sounds. Again, this is the pair. The first one, which looks like an O with a line through it, is the unvoiced, and that is the sound th, which is the same as the initial sound of think, and the voiced version looks like a D with a little bar across the top section, and that is the voiced version of this sound, and that is the, and that is the same as the initial sound of that. Okay, so those are the dental fricatives. They are particularly useful because they are commonly difficult for children to use, and it is not unusual for us to get transcripts where there are issues with the dental fricatives. There's a screen later on that will give you a bit more detail about that, so that's a good one to take particular notice of. Next, the front consonants tend to come before the back consonants, and when we say front and back, we're talking about whereabouts in the mouth the articulators are. Whereabouts is the tongue, what's happening with the lips. So the front consonants, so sounds like p, b, t and d, they are at the front. So we've got They're all plosives in this case, and so p and b both using both lips, so those are bilabial plosives, and then t and d both tongue on the alveolar ridge just behind the teeth, so they are alveolar plosives, and they tend to be easier for children to articulate than the ones that are further back, like the k and the g, which are the velar plosives in this case. So it seems to be easier for children to create the sounds where they are using their tongue or their teeth or their lips at the front of the mouth. Next is that plosives come before fricatives generally, and that's not to say that all plosives come before any fricatives, but plosives do tend to be that little bit easier, and that's because a child has to be able to close the articulators and then open them again, let the air build up and then open those articulators again to let that sound explode out, and that tends to be easier than actually allowing air to come out at a particular rate, and to do it slowly and create that friction. To hold it, you've got to hold the airflow to create fricatives. So plosives, you know, easier. P is easier than s, because you have to hold that airflow going through. Next then we've got plosives at the beginning of words come before those at the end. So words like dog and boy, which have plosives at the beginning, are easier for children to articulate than things like hat, where the t at the end has to be articulated with that explosion, and so the early plosives are the easier ones. And then finally for this screen, fricatives at the end of words tend to come before the ones at the beginning of words. So children will first acquire the use of fricatives in the word final position, so the end of a word. So if a child's talking about a snake, for instance, they can often say the word hiss and hold that s at the end of the word, that fricative s at the end of a word. But to say the word snake, where they have to hold it at the beginning of the word, can be a bit trickier, because they have to hold this for so long and then they have to then continue on to the rest of the word, and so it's not unusual for a child, rather than to say snake, for them to say nake, or things like sweets can turn into wheats. Okay, so different order, different places, worth making some revision cards up for this to help you and to give yourself some examples as well. Consonant simplification is an issue then as well. So when children are starting to pronounce words, there are several different ways that they can sort of simplify things, and that they do simplify things, whether consciously or unconsciously. These are deletion, substitution and cluster reduction. So deletion is where they just delete one of the consonants, so they drop a consonant, particularly at the end of words. So they tend to say do instead of dog and things like that, cat instead of cat. Next then there's substitution, and that might be that they replace a consonant, one that they find difficult, for one that they find a bit easier. So for instance, they might say tup instead of cup. Now tup, the t phoneme then is a front phoneme. As we said in the last slide, a front phoneme is easier to say than a back. So tup, which is the alveolar plosive t, rather than cup, which is the velar plosive k. And so, you know, it is easier to say an alveolar plosive than it is to say a velar plosive, and so tup, they might substitute tup for cup. And then finally the cluster reduction. Okay, so we talked about consonant clusters when we did phonetics, and so that's just the clusters of consonant sounds. Remember, we're always talking about sound when we're talking about we're in phonology, we're talking about phonemes. Okay, so when we look at consonant clusters where we have you know, 2 or more consonant phonemes together. In this case, our example is green, so we've got a gr, green, and a child might reduce that consonant cluster, the gr, to geen, to a g, geen, rather than green. Okay, so it's not uncommon for that to be sort of reduced and simplified as a cluster in its own right. Other common phonological features are things like addition, where a vowel, phoneme, or another phoneme will be added to the end of a word rather than the deletion that we've previously seen. So in this example we have the schwa sound, the sound added to the end of dog, so we get dogger instead of dog. Now it's not uncommon to see schwa added to the end of words, although other sounds and other phonemes can be added, but schwa is the most common sound in the English language, and therefore it is a useful one to get to grips with, for you to be able to spot for yourself. In the IPA the symbol is the upside down E, and I'm sure you've seen that before. Check your chart and have a look at that. It's an easy one to remember. If you think of the word the sound at the end of the word that is the schwa sound. Assimilation next then. So this is when one consonant affects, or one consonant phoneme affects a phoneme next to it or very close to it. And that is, here we have the example tub, which becomes bub, and here the t, so the alveolar plosive, has assimilated to the final b of the bub in the word, and changed to the b itself, and that is that the t has sort of started to prepare to become b a bit early and has turned itself into bub rather than staying as tub. And so here we see that the assimilation is in preparation for the next sound coming along. The changes happened a bit early, but it can work the other way as well, and so we often get assimilation where the previous sound continues and affects sounds following it. Reduplication next then, so that's simply a case of repeating the repetition of the phoneme, so we get moo moo in this case. Voicing and devoicing are next then, and so we've talked earlier about voiced sounds and devoiced sounds, or unvoiced sounds, and they are the pairs where we have the same place and manner of articulation, but the voice, what's happening in the throat differs, and so it's not unusual for those to be swapped round. So for voicing, we've got an example here where the s, the fricative s, which is unvoiced, has become the voiced version, which is z. So again, they are a pair. S and z are a pair, but in this case, what usually we would see as an unvoiced s, unvoiced version, the sock, we have got the voiced version, it becomes zock. Devoicing then is the opposite way round, so the unvoiced part of the pair is used rather than the more appropriate voiced part of the pair, and so here we have bag turning to pag. Other common phonological features are the prosodic features, so the things like intonation, emphatic stress, tempo, that sort of thing, volume, and so those are all things that a child will acquire slowly but surely. They will, from a very early age, have those used towards them in child-directed speech. If we go back to the beginning of this unit, where in the videos mums were talking to very young babies and they were using intonation, that very melodic way of talking with a sort of pitch going up and down. Also asking the babies questions and using intonation at the end of the questions, which is very common in questions. We often do that. It's a sign that we're asking a question. But this, so the children will have been had that in their environment from a very early age. Just as a reminder for the specific terms then, we have phoneme sounds like p and b, so that's a pair, p being the voiceless or unvoiced phoneme and b being its a voiced pair, and we call these bilabial plosives. So bi is two, labial is lips, so that's both lips being closed at the beginning of the creation of these plosives, and then plosives, that's the manner of articulation, so the way the air comes out of the mouth to create these sounds. And a plosive is where the air builds up behind something holding that air, in this case the two lips, builds up and then explodes out of the once the articulators are open, so explodes once the lips are open. So p and b are explosive, and so I always remember plosives because they are explosive. Okay, it's a good way to remember it. And these are some of the first ones, first phonemes to be acquired, and that is because they are relatively easy for a child to close their lips and allow the air to build up and then just to release them, although that is sort of more of an assumption than 100% knowledge, because it's not clear if this is the case. Specifics then of labiodental phonemes and alveolar plosives, they're also acquired early on. Okay, so labiodental, so labio then is lip, dental is teeth, so it's where you put your teeth, your top teeth on your bottom lip. Okay, so f and v. All right, so f and v, they are both a pair again. F is the unvoiced version, v is the voiced version, and then the alveolar plosives t and d, again another pair. This time the tongue is on the alveolar ridge behind the teeth, so the gum bit behind your teeth, t and d, unvoiced and voiced, and these are often used as substitutions for other phonemes, and so it's very useful to know these terms, because we are often, when we're looking at children's speech and analysing children's speech, we will often see these used to substitute for a different phoneme. So to know these phonemes, to know what we can call them when we're analysing, is very useful and shows your knowledge to the exam board. Other specifics then, alveolar fricatives then, so s and z. So in this case, again, tongue touching the alveolar ridge, or sort of across a wider stretch of the alveolar ridge rather than just in front of the front two teeth. Fricatives then, because the airflow is being held, s and z. You can always tell the difference between a fricative and a plosive. You can't hold a plosive. If you try and hold a p, you can't. You can hold the part of it, but that isn't the phoneme. You can't hold a p, but a s and a z you can keep hold of, and that's why you know that they are fricatives. And they are quite challenging because you have to hold them to create the sound. Okay, they need more control of the articulators. Okay, so again, these might be some of the sounds that a child doesn't use because they struggle with them, and again, that's useful to know those then. So two very useful phonemes to know and to recognise the symbols for are the dental fricatives. These are useful because there are the most difficult phonemes for the children to pick up. They are ones that we commonly see substituted or changed in some way, but not just in child language acquisition. We see these substituted in regional variations, so in accents, but also in the historical unit we sometimes see that these are different to what we might expect. So very much worth knowing these, knowing the symbols, knowing the names, and understanding how they can be used. Okay, so we will start by looking at them. I mean, again, we can see they are a pair. The first one, the one that looks like an O with a line through the middle, that is the unvoiced of the pair, and that is the one that sounds like th, the same as the initial of the sound think. And then the other one, the one that looks like a D with a cross across the top, that is the voiced one of the pair, and that sounds like a sort of heavier sound, which is the, and that sounds like the initial sound of the word that. Okay, so we've got th for think and th for that. Think and that. And we can really tell the difference between them if we swap those over, and if I put the voiced where the voiceless should be and the voiceless where the voice should be, we end up with think and that. Okay, and we can hear that that's not correct, and so we can hear that it really does emphasize that they are quite different phonemes. And so we need to look at the substitution and how these substitutions can work, and there are several very common ways that they are substituted. Okay, so you can see at the bottom of the screen then, so we have something called TH fronting, and that is where the voiceless th is of a word is replaced, is substituted by the f phoneme. Now both of the th and the f are both fricatives, okay, but whereas th is a dental fricative, f is a labiodental fricative. Okay, so just a small difference there, but it makes the sound quite different. So we get things changing to things. We get words like 3 changing to free. Okay, so that's one that you will probably have heard before. So that's TH fronting. There's also one where we have the voiced dental fricative, which is changed for a v sound, and again we have, you know, the voiced dental fricative is changed for another fricative. Again, it's the labiodental fricative, the voiced labiodental fricative, and funnily enough, the v is the pair, one of the pair of f, so f and v are a pair as well. And here we have the substitution inside a word, and so we go from together to being together. Okay, but also we might see this as in things like things might or this might change to this as well. That's a common one. So the point is that when you see something substituted, you need to be able to say in what way it's been substituted, what is different, and think about why it's different. In this case, dental fricatives are the last thing for a child to acquire, generally in their articulation at least. And then finally we have something called TH stopping. And that is where the voiced dental fricative is changed. Not only is it changed, but it's changed from a fricative to a plosive. So it goes from the to d. Okay, so it becomes d, an alveolar plosive. All right, and that is the change from them to dem. Another common one is the change from that to dat. Okay, it's very common to see children saying dat, and so that would be a change from a voiced dental fricative to a voiced alveolar plosive. All right, and if you can say that in your exam, in your analysis, you know, that would show your knowledge and your understanding of phonetics and your understanding of child language acquisition. And there will be lots of nice ticks for you there on your exam paper. Finally then, just a list then. We've covered most of these, I think. Yes. So deletion then, phonemes or syllables are deleted. So we might sort of have individual phonemes dropped, but it does tend to be in the word final position at the end. Okay, but make sure that you're using the right term, so deletion. Substitution then, so where, you know, one sound is swapped for another, and think about what sound is being swapped. Okay, think about whereabouts in the mouth that sound is being created or should be created. Think about how it's created, what is the airflow of it, you know, why is it being substituted? There will be a reason for that substitution, and one of the things that you need to say in an analysis is, you know, what is that reason? Consonant cluster reduction next then. Okay, so just reducing from 2 or 3 consonant sounds together, consonant phonemes together, and taking that down to 1 or 2 just to make it easier. Okay, so if we look at that word crisps, okay, we can see at the end we've got the S, P and S sounds all together. So we've got from crisps, we've got sps, okay, sps. So there's quite a lot of work going on there in terms of articulation and in terms of the manner of articulation as well as the place. So we've got the S sound, which is a fricative, the P sound, which is a plosive, and then back to a S sound, which is a fricative. So quite a lot for a child to do to create the sps at the end. And so it's not unusual for us to hear crips, okay? And for that first fricative s to be missed. So instead of saying crisps, we get crips. Okay, so that is consonant cluster reduction then, or consonant cluster simplification, sometimes it will be called. And it's just simplifying those consonant clusters to make them easier to say. Phoneme addition then, so that's that adding on or adding in phonemes, okay, which can often make things easier to say. And so here, I mean, on the other slide we had that schwa added at the end of dog to make dogger, but we can have phonemes added inside words. So here we've gone from block to berlock, so from block to berlock. So we've got that schwa added, and it often is a schwa that's added, and schwa is the most common sound in the English language, that upside down E that you can see there that's underlined, that's the sound. So if you think about the word the final phoneme of the word the is schwa, that's okay, so berlock. And so that just can make it a little bit easier to say than going straight from a b to a l, block. Yeah, so a berlock instead of blo. It can be quite tricky to say two consonants together. So there, instead of reducing one of those and deleting one of those consonant phonemes, a phoneme is being added in between them to make it easier to say. Assimilation then is next. So this is also a common feature of connected speech. Remember, assimilation is where one phoneme affects another phoneme either before it or after it, or in close proximity to it. And here we've got that person, yeah, becomes that person, that person. So the plosive, the alveolar plosive at the end of that has been assimilated to the p, the plosive, the bilabial plosive that's coming in person. That person instead of that person. That's very common even in adults, but it's certainly something to look out for. Devoicing then, so we talked about voicing and devoicing in the previous slide. So swapping a voiced phoneme for an unvoiced phoneme or vice versa is not uncommon, and we can, you know, it's quite understandable why that might happen. And then reduplication then, so that dada and mama and moo, okay, those sorts of things, quite easy to say.